All right, let's talk about something we hear constantly, right? Federal deficits, the national debt. These are words that get thrown around a ton, especially when politics heat up. And honestly, they sound huge, maybe a little intimidating, and super complicated. But don't worry, we're going to cut right through all that noise today. For decades, we've heard these warnings about a looming fiscal crisis. It's almost felt like the boy who cried wolf. But what if the wolf is finally at the door? What if the very rules that used to govern our national finances have just been completely thrown out the window? That's the big question we're going to tackle.
Okay, so first things first. Before we can really dig into what's happening, we all need to be speaking the same language. You hear these two words, deficit and debt, used like they're the same thing all the time. But they're not. They mean very different things, and that difference is key.
So yeah, what is the difference? Let's get this straight once and for all. Think about the deficit like this. It's a one-year thing. It's like your household budget for just this year. If the government spends more money in a single year than it brings in from taxes, that shortfall, that is the deficit for that specific year. It's an annual measurement. That's it. The public debt, on the other hand, well, that's the big one. That's the grand total. It's kind of like your total credit card balance that you've built up over years. The debt is what happens when you take all those yearly deficits and the very few surpluses we've had, and you add them all up over the entire history of the country.
And wow, this is what it looks like in the real world. Every single one of those annual deficits we just talked about just gets piled on top of the last one. It's what creates this relentlessly climbing mountain of total public debt.
Now, for most of modern U.S. history, there was a pretty predictable rhythm to all of this. It wasn't written down, but there were these unwritten rules, this clear pattern that tied how the economy was doing to how big the deficit was. Let's take a look at how it used to work. So check out the 1960s. The economy was strong. Things were booming. And where's the deficit? That line is just hovering right around zero. When the economy's doing well and tax money is flowing in, the government's budget was more or less balanced. That was rule number one.
Then you get recessions. Those are the gray shaded areas on the chart. In the tough times of the 70s and 80s, you can see the deficit gets worse. The line dips way down. But here's the crucial part. As soon as the economy got back on its feet, the deficit started to shrink again. The pattern was holding.
And the 1990s are just the perfect example of this in action. After that little recession in the early 90s, the economy took off. It was so strong that the deficit didn't just get smaller, it completely disappeared. We were actually running a surplus, taking in more than we spent. You can see the line goes above zero. The system is working exactly like you'd expect. This whole predictable dance actually has a name. Economists call it a cyclically balanced budget. And the idea behind it is really simple. You run deficits when the economy is struggling to help people out, and then you run surpluses when the economy is booming to pay for it. Over the long haul, through all the ups and downs, it's supposed to roughly even out. But then something happened. Starting around 2016, that predictable cycle, those old fiscal rules we've been talking about, they just broke. The connection between a healthy economy and a small deficit completely fell apart, and it's pushed us into some really weird, uncharted territory. Okay, look at this. This slide really tells the whole story. On the left, you've got the 90s. Economy gets better, and boom, the deficit shrinks and turns into a surplus. That's the old rulebook. Now look at the right, the period after 2016. The economy was recovering, unemployment was dropping, but the deficit was getting bigger. It was doing the exact opposite of what it was supposed to do. Economist Scott Sumner put it pretty bluntly. He said it was like the grown-ups in the room had totally lost control, and that we'd adopted a fiscal policy that was just completely disconnected from reality, creating what he calls a truly dire fiscal situation. And this wasn't just some temporary fluke. By early 2022, unemployment was at 3.5%. That's super low, a classic sign of a hot economy. And yet, the deficit was still huge and actually getting worse. I mean, based on history, we should have been getting close to a surplus. The old rules were officially gone. So this all leads to a really basic question, right? If the government is spending way, way more money than it's getting from taxes, where on earth is all that extra cash coming from? It's not magic, and the answer is maybe a little more complicated than you think. So economically speaking, that money has to come from somewhere. There's no free lunch. It means one of three things is happening. Either people like us are saving more and spending less, or companies are investing less in things like new factories, or We're borrowing it from the rest of the world by importing a lot more than we export. But hold on, there's a fourth, really powerful player in this game, the Federal Reserve. The Fed can step in and buy government bonds with brand new money that it essentially creates out of thin air. It's a process called monetizing the debt. And if you look at this chart of the Fed's assets, you can see they've been doing this on an absolutely massive scale, especially since 2008. Of course, the Fed isn't the only one lending the government money. The US borrows from all sorts of places: big corporations, banks, mutual funds, even regular people buying savings bonds. And of course, foreign governments, who have long seen US debt as one of the safest investments in the entire world. Okay, so we've got record debt, and the old rules for keeping it in check seem to be completely broken. So what? Why should you or I actually care? What are the real-world consequences of living in this new reality? Well, to really get the consequences, first we have to answer the question, who do we actually owe all this money to? And the answer basically falls into two big buckets: people and institutions inside the US and people and institutions outside the US. And that distinction is absolutely critical. See, when the debt is held by Americans, maybe in your pension plan or a mutual fund, the interest payments are basically just money moving around inside the country. Your tax dollars go to pay another American who owns a government bond. But when foreigners own the debt, those huge interest payments leave the US economy completely. Which brings us right here to the final lingering question. For decades, we had a system that, for the most part, made sense. In good times, we saved. In bad times, we spent to help out. That system now looks like it's shattered, replaced by a new normal of permanent, massive deficits, no matter how the economy is doing. So what are the rules of this new era? And more importantly, what is the final bill going to be?